Oh, okay. So we'll get started here. My name is Brian Lantz. I'm here on behalf of the Schiller Institute and supporters of LaRouche and LaRouche's ideas, and then LaRouche. I want to thank you all for coming, and we're going to be covering a looming financial collapse in corporate debt. That's going to be kind of the substance of the discussion today. I'll start out with an overview of recent developments, which are very positive, and then we'll move on from there. For those that are watching from a distance, from home or office and whatnot, or reviewing the material later, we're going to go through a lot of slides quickly as we get on with this. But you, of course, you have the advantage of using YouTube, and so you can stop and start if you want to study those slides a little bit more as you go. All right, so let me start just right off with Korea, because it's been on people's minds, it's been in the headlines, and there's been a back and forth, dramatically presented in the media. This is what we have here is a map of the area. I think you can see it. I just thought it's useful because you see that immediately. You see that you're talking about an area which is where a lot intersects. Russia, China, the interests of these nations, Japan, the Koreas, and beyond. What's going on at the moment is a very affirmative collaboration between the Trump administration, the U.S. government, and China, and particularly the personal relationship between President Trump and President Xi Jinping is key in this, but also involving other nations and other leaders. Prime Minister Abe of Japan, well, South Korea will soon have a new government, so that's in the process of change, but there's discussions there. The leading candidate, Moon, in South Korea, says he wants a restart to the six-party talks, which involve these various countries. Russia, Prime Minister Abe of Japan was just in Moscow for consultations, discussion, both on their bilateral relationships, but also on the question of North Korea, and on and on and on. So this is rich. Six-party is Russia, China, South Korea, North Korea, Japan, the United States. I think that's the total of the six parties involved. And this goes back to the sunshine policy. This is what, in essence, we're seeing reemerge. Back in the period between 1998 and 2008, President Kim Dae-jung of South Korea, the president at the time, initiated the sunshine policy, which was an opening up. The United States, then this was the Clinton administration, supported this policy, collaborated in it. The other nations of the area did. And they moved forward with essentially moves to take down the border, the wall between, so to speak, North and South Korea. They moved to replace North Korea's plutonium-producing reactor by mutual agreement with a light water reactor for power, of course, but to avoid the production of weapons-grade plutonium. They opened up rail lines. They opened up an industrial development park for North Korean labor. North Korea has a skilled labor force. And this policy proceeded up until Bush and Cheney came into the White House. They said they cut it off after 2001, after 9/11, so to speak. That was kind of the lever for breaking the policy. And they said, we're not going to deal with the North Koreans. They're they're dictators, we're not going to deal with them. And they broke off this process. The South Koreans continued the effort with the collaboration of Russia and China. And these rail lines into North Korea went on to the Trans-Siberian Railway into China. This was a linking up of the entire Korean peninsula from south through north on into Eurasia, a linking up for the first time of the Korean peninsula into the Eurasian land bridge. Kim Jong-un attempted to continue that policy. He received, by the way, the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts in the year 2000. But the policy fell prey to the administrations of Cheney, Bush, and Obama ultimately. What we have now, this is a little bit of background I thought was necessary, but what we have now is a reassertion of this cooperative approach. The strategic patience, so-called policy of Obama, which basically was telling the North Koreans, we won't talk to you until you do everything we say we want, is now being replaced, as exemplified by Secretary of State Tillerson's remarks at the United Nations last week, that we are going to consider reopening aid programs to North Korea under the right circumstances. We're not seeking regime change, which was the clear intention of the Obama administration, as with Libya and Gaddafi and with Iraq. And you can imagine how that was viewed from North Korea. Remember, Libya, as well as Iraq, had given up their so-called weapons of mass destruction. The North Koreans figured that's not, as Tillerson has emphasized, the North Koreans see their nuclear weapons as their guarantee of survival. So if you're going to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula, which everybody agrees to, well, then you've got to secure, you've got to provide for the security of North Korea to find its own way and collaborate as it can and increasingly will with South Korea. So this is back on the table. But it's broader than this. And quickly, if you watched the webcast last night on the LaRouchePAC.com website, a clip of this speech was presented there. But Secretary of State Tillerson, Donald Trump's Secretary of State, gave an address to the U.S. State Department on May 3rd. So just this last week. And this is, let me just quote here, it's just a couple of paragraphs from his remarks. And you'll see that this goes beyond the question of Korea. Quote, the way we have been delivering was in many ways shaped and as a residual of the Cold War era. And in many respects, we're not yet transitioned ourselves to this new reality. And you can see when we have our conversations with NATO, another example, there are many institutions around the world that were created during a different era. So one of the things, as we get into this opportunity to look at how we get our work done, this is Tillerson, Secretary of State, is to think about the world as it is today and to leave behind, well, we do it this way because we've been doing it this way for the last 30 or 40 years or 50 years because of all that was created in a different environment. I guess what I'm inviting all of you to do, speaking to his fellow State Department employees, the entire State Department was pulled together for this confab. I guess what I'm inviting all of you to do is to approach this effort that we're going to undertake with no constraints to your thinking, with none. So this is Tillerson, some of his off-the-cuff remarks delivered as he paced the floor to State Department officials saying, look, we're in a new era. We're going to rethink everything. We're going to take a different approach. We're moving beyond the Cold War era and the institutions of the Cold War. Now, this absolutely freaks the British out. The British Empire is totally freaked out by this. And this is key to understanding what's going on. What's the leitmotif of events? of this period. From London, you have this continued orchestration, this continued attempt to drive a wedge, to keep a wedge between the United States and China and Russia. That's the most important wedge that's got to be maintained from the British geopolitical standpoint. If the United States, Russia, and China, and with India, for example, and Japan and Germany, other countries obviously play their roles, come together, then essentially the environment that led to 2 world wars, the axioms of geopolitics are overthrown. Now you see this in Syria as well. What's going on in Syria? Well, you now have an agreement. There's been these talks going on in Astana, Kazakhstan, which is far, far away on the other side of the world. Well, these talks are now being supported by the United States. These talks involve Turkey, they involve Iran, they involve Russia. They're the underwriters of these negotiations, and they're supported by the government of Syria. And they've reached an agreement to create 4 deconfliction zones. 4 deconfliction zones in which aircraft, aviation, military aviation will be kept out. Russian, they already stopped in these areas overflights, bombings, and so on and so forth since May 1st. This will now be taken up by the United States as well. And these areas will be used to separate out the terrorists from the nationals, the Syrian nationals, from normal folk, right? So reconstruction can begin. It'll also allow the Syrian army to concentrate on areas north and east of Palmyra, that is Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa, in terms of their military operations. So that's spread out over the whole country trying to fight terrorists. It's going to delimit the areas they're going to have to operate in. So this has been worked out. So the United States is now de facto collaborating with Russia, with Turkey, also Iran, and implicitly the Syrian government to bring some order into the process and allow for a coordinated operation to focus on wiping out terrorism, wiping out ISIS and al-Nusra. Right? So this is proceeding ahead. This is what Trump is doing. And again, this freaks the British out. Now, Americans, first of all, they don't know about the Astana process. They don't know much about what's going on over Korea because there isn't much covered in the press. But this is what's going on in terms of foreign policy. And now Trump is going to be, well, he was, Lavrov and Tillerson were on the phone today, foreign minister of Russia. They were on the phone today. They'll be meeting in Alaska in 4 or 5 days in the context of an Arctic summit. Trump is going to be going to the Middle East. He'll be visiting the kind of, you could say, the headquarters of the 3 major religions of the West. He'll be in Jerusalem. He'll be in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem possibly. He'll be in Mecca, or he'll be at least in Riyadh, where there'll be a meeting of the Islamic countries, and he'll be going to the Vatican. So what Trump is doing here in terms of foreign policy is in conjunction with Tillerson and so forth, is really quite extraordinary. And the American people need to have a better sense of this process. Now, let's fold in another element into this quickly. The Beijing summit. The Belt and Road Summit is the 14th and 15th of May, just so a little more than a week away. You have 30 national leaders, presidents, prime ministers attending, including Putin from Russia and so forth. You have otherwise leading delegations. Germany's, one of their top ministers is leading the delegation from Germany, for example. That's a little bit of a breakthrough. You have over 100 countries that are going to be represented there. And of course, this is over this enormous multi-trillion-dollar program of infrastructure development across Eurasia, reaching into Africa, but also the Americas, also into South America, with the Bioceanic Railroad under discussion and deliberation, dam projects, energy projects, science cities being built in Ecuador, one being planned in Peru, and so on and so forth. This is China's initiative, as many of you know, to the world, a win-win policy, which flies in the face of the kind of grim view which has taken over in the West. This kind of grim view, which is actually British, it's geopolitical. It is the idea, I have no permanent allies, I only have permanent interests. You know, my best friend will screw me tomorrow, right? That kind of idea in the back of your head, you know, I'm gonna have to punch that sucker's lights out at some point, you know, even if he's my friend today. You know, it's grim, you know, and you see it among small contractors, guys that are just struggling to get by, you know, and they're hunkered down, right? But it's throughout the society, and we tend to project this out into the world in terms of you know, as a world outlook. Well, here comes China, ironically, with the kind of viewpoint that Lincoln, you know, understood, that a Roosevelt understood, that a John Quincy Adams promoted, a community of interests among sovereign nation states. And Tillerson was talking about this as well, in the sense that he was defining for the State Department, people working under him, that we are now going to make a distinction between policies and values. We have our values, yes, they're enshrined in the Constitution. We have our values and we have our policies. Now, if we want to get our policies across, we want to do certain things in terms of national security and economics for the economic national interest. Well, it's not always the case that the best thing you want to do is push your values into the face of somebody that you're trying to work with otherwise. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. But he was saying, you know, we have our values and we're going to promote them, but our policies come first based on the areas of national security and economic, you know, the economic prosperity of our nation. And values are going to be, you know, there as well on the side. So this is a different approach. If you think of all the responsibility to protect, oh, we had to overthrow Gaddafi. Oh, we had to overthrow Saddam Hussein. Oh, we had to do that. We have, you know, and one war after another. And what did we get out of all these wars? Not by accident, we got nothing. But the British Empire of finance, of control of resources and so forth, kept nations at each other's throats, kept whole regions of the world, created a situation where religions were virtually at each other's throats, and you know, and now they're attempting to perpetrate a new Cold War, at least, if not a hot one, between the U.S. and Russia and the U.S. and China. That's that's been the theme of the neocons and their initiatives. This is what Trump is breaking out of. So we have this emergence of a kind of new four powers. LaRouche called it a four powers perspective of bringing the United States together with Russia, China, and India, and that this would be the perspective for the next 50 years. Tillerson, by the way, emphasized that what he is working on, what the Trump administration is working on with China, is a perspective for the next 50 to 150 years. Where are we going to be 50, 150 years from now? Right. This is, you know, so this is a different perspective. So finally, I would just like to underscore our role in this process. I have put the slides up again. Yeah, the next slide, please. Yeah, that one there. That's great. This is a map. It's a couple years old, so you can see 2015 of the Belt and Road Initiative of what was entitled One Belt, One Road of China reaching out to the world. There's now 39 rail routes between cities in China and Europe, and of course this is across Russia and so forth, the Eastern European countries and so on. 39 rail routes. Trains leave every day, going east and going west. And then you have the maritime route around the tip of India to North Africa. You can see it there in blue. I'm not going to dwell on that further. But in terms of our role in this process, China Daily had an article just yesterday. Trump encouraged to attend Belt and Road Forum. Now this is a major paper affiliated with the government of China, closely affiliated, and it's essentially an interview with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder of the Schiller Institute, and her urging that Trump, that quote, the best would be if President Trump would attend the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing in person. The second best would be a second personal meeting between him and President Xi Jinping immediately afterwards in China. And she goes on to discuss the economic aspects of this in terms of Chinese cooperation. She says Chinese cooperation in building up the infrastructure requirements of the U.S. would help to rejuvenate the American economy. Because the economies of China and the U.S. are complementary, as Zepp-LaRouche said, mutual investments could go up dramatically with the cooperation within the initiative. So I'll leave it at that. But the China Daily, featuring Helga Zepp-LaRouche in its English language publication, which circulates internationally, just underscores our role and signals really the long-term role that we played in developing this process. So let me move on here. I think I've covered things. Just a couple of things on the Belt and Road. In the last 24 hours, a 7-nation agreement was reached on freight rail service. It includes Russia, China, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, Belarus, Germany, and Poland. This is going to accelerate these routes, now reaching 27 cities in the West. In Valencia, Spain, the Chinese ambassador to Spain visited Valencia, announcing that they wish to make Valencia a hub for the Mediterranean for the Belt and Road, and pointed out that Valencia was the major port of entry for Chinese silk back during the old Silk Road. The actual building in Valencia, which was the center of that silk trade, apparently still exists and is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So this process is going on. So now let's turn to the financial collapse that's looming otherwise. I hope I've given a sense of the way that the Belt and Road Initiative, the way forward that Trump is speaking of. He's also discussing Glass-Steagall. We'll come back to that in a little bit in terms of the necessary reforms here in the United States, a really necessary transformation that's required. Okay, first of all, where are we? This is the world. We're going to get down to the United States here very quickly. But this is just an interesting kind of picture. You see across the bottom from left to right, 1999 up to 2015. A friend of mine, a researcher over at Rice, passed this on to me. It shows the emerging economies' contribution to world growth is outweighing that of the advanced economies. Although the U.S., of course, is still playing a significant role. The U.S. role is bouncing up there and down there in black. But you see the blue is the emerging economies. It's just a useful kind of snapshot. I'm not trying to dwell on it. You can see where it drops through the floor. That was, of course, the 2007-2009 financial collapse. Going on to the next. Okay, now, remember the collapse. And I'll point something out here on this in terms of LaRouche's forecasting on this. On July 17th, in 2007, there was a Reuters wire story. It was carried in the New York Times. And it reported that two Bear Stearns hedge funds had just been found to be virtually worthless. That was July 17th. At that point, LaRouche announced the crash is on, which he had been warning of, that was coming, that was building up. We'd covered the building up of the mortgage bubble, including a feature story in March of 2007 titled "How U.S. Mortgage Crisis Can Trigger Global Crash." And LaRouche in July called it and said it's on. Well, as you know, what began was a massive bailout operation. And as a feature of that, interest rates went to virtually zero. I just think this is a very dramatic way of just presenting that reality, which has still been, up until recently, the reality. Now, this has become the basis of an enormous bubble. Go on to the next. And it's fed the global derivatives markets. It's fed speculation. It has not returned money, resources back into the real economy. Manufacturing continues to contract. Farmers in trouble. Incomes are down 50% from 2 years ago for most farmers across the United States, farmers and ranchers. Go on to the next. And those are not the most important charts. All right. Now, how did all this money get into the system? $18 trillion were pumped into the system. Well, the central banks, and here we have them colorized, printed money, printed Federal Reserve notes and so forth. And what did they do with it? They bought the worthless financial paper off the books of the banks who were collapsing, and the hedge funds and so on and so forth that those banks were financing. If you want to go through it, you can go through here and sort this out. But this was across the world that this bailout operation was launched, to the tune of at least $18 trillion. Where is the Fed? The Fed is the blue one. Blue. The blue is the Fed. Okay, go on. And this just is, it's another version of the same thing. These are all official figures. IMF, World Bank. I mean, these are not fake news figures, except the IMF and World Bank are pretty fakey themselves.
What is the PBOC?
People's Bank of China.
Oh, okay. So they.
Yeah, oh yeah. They pump money too, although they used it for more useful purposes. Yeah. We can get into that. But here's his percentage of GDP. You know what was going on. Enormous. As a percentage of the entire gross domestic product of the advanced sector and moderately developing sectors, the equivalent of almost 50% of that economic activity was being pumped in as fresh money. Go ahead to the next. Again, this is impressionistic. You might have heard about this in the last few days. There's a meltdown going on right now in Canada. This begins to get us into some of the features of this Home Capital Group Inc., also known as Home Trusts. They've collapsed now 70% in value just in the last, since April 19th. It turned out that at least 10% of the mortgages that they were writing were fraudulent, just outright fraudulent. The collapse of Home Capital Group, which is a tiny fraction of the Canadian real estate market, its collapse is now triggering others like Equitable Group, which has lost 33% of its value in the last 2 weeks or so. And there's meetings convened of the CEOs of the top Canadian banks and of course top banks connected to the markets in Canada, out of the United States and elsewhere, to try to figure out how to manage the situation. This, if you can see this, this is who in Canada, where's the money going to? What's the money being lent to? Well, as you can see here, it's real estate.
We can't read it.
Well, the light color is the lightest color there is the increase over time from 1981.
81.
Yep. 2016. All the way up to 2016 of real estate. While the biggest drop there is in the purple, that's manufacturers. From the top, dropping down. This is Canada. Again, the real estate bubble. The real estate bubble kept growing in Canada right through the 2007-2009 financial crash. It just kept going up. So it's, in terms of the real estate market, it's the hottest market, that I know of. Not that I'm trying to pretend to be an expert on it, but it's definitely, one of the hottest markets in the world, with a lot of foreign money coming in and so forth as well. So that's now on the ropes, and they're fearing a collapse there. Go on to the next.
Is there an element of Americans fleeing into Canada?
I don't think I don't think most of Hollywood has fled into Canada because of the Trump election. I don't think that ever materialized.
But maybe investing.
Oh, investing, and there's money from China and elsewhere. Yeah, Russia, I'm sure. Okay, so this is the monetary base. This is not exactly M1, M2, but it's basically a rough equivalent figure that this is the growth of the money supply in the United States over the same period for the country, not just this is from the St. Louis Fed. That's why it says St. Louis adjusted monetary base, but it's a national figure. They put these figures out regularly, and you can see where it's leveling off there a little bit towards in the recent period since into 2016.
Can you specify again what it's showing exactly? St. Louis adjusted what?
Monetary base. It's a term, monetary base. It's a figure. It's all the cash out in circulation plus, and it's a measure of liquidity in the economy.
Okay.
Cash. I mean, that's the simplest.
So it shows
Cash plus.
2007 way up to this.
To 1985 all the way to 2015.
2015.
Yep. The next one is another version, just so you get an idea of how wild this has been. If you thought you were living in a nightmare the last 5 or 10 years, you're right.
You're right.
Yes, you're right. You're sane. Here's going way back. This is stretching it back out to 86 or 85 or something like that. But up until the crash, you can see there was a growth of the money supply, and it wasn't all rational at all. Remember the term irrational exuberance from Greenspan? But with the crash, then the money supply just, the Fed started printing money, started buying up this worthless paper, which the central banks now hold on their balance sheets. The Fed is choking on financial paper, toxic assets and government bonds that they bought to unleash cash into the system and try to hold the bubble together. Okay, keep going. Okay, so this gets into a major feature of what's going on right now. Non-financial corporations. It's not shown here. Non-financial, but this is related to that. Non-financial corporations in the United States. The debt of those non-financial corporations, everything except for banks, basically, right, has reached 13.5 trillion. Okay, that's a 75% increase in corporate debt in the United States since the crash.
Oh my God.
75% increase. Okay, it's increased by $8 trillion since the crash. Now, the primary utilization of that cash, those corporations haven't been going out and building new production facilities, hiring more workers. That has not been going on. Right? We have a contracting workforce, except for low-wage, hamburger flipping jobs and so forth. Okay, where's that money been going? Well, a huge proportion of it, the vast majority of it, has been loans to corporations to buy their own stock. Apple, ExxonMobil, you name it. Large corporate, this is what they've been doing with their money. Remember this idea, you may have heard it, there was even a radio show this morning on NPR, one of these, it doesn't give you an understanding of the implications of it, but it was one of these little vignette stories on this process. Shareholder value. That became the mantra back in the 1980s. That that companies, the only thing that the companies should worry about and think about and should base their policy on was increasing shareholder value. Their shareholders had to come first. Social responsibilities, so on and so forth, the workforce, that, was all by and by. Another way you could argue it, that they argued was, if you put shareholder value first, everything else will follow from that, because your company's prospering, and so, it'll trickle down and everybody will do better in the long run. Well, what happened is part of this process was then CEOs. Remember the corporate raiders? The corporate raiders who said the CEOs aren't doing their job. They're off on the golf course. Look at the price earnings ratios aren't getting any better. Profits are too low. We want to take over. You shareholders back us. We're coming in. We're buying stock. And if you join with us, we're going to take over and we're going to put this thing right and we're going to increase your shareholder value.
Then they lost the art.
So then the CEOs, their wages, their pay were then tied to shareholder value. And of course, the CEOs and other executives, it dawned on them that if they tied their own returns to shareholder value, as the shareholder stock went up, their paycheck would go up, right? Which is why you have these CEOs now, got their corporate presidents and so on, their treasurers, and they're all getting these checks, and there's these 5 million, 10 million, 20 million, a year bonuses, right? I mean, you see this stuff, and it's bizarre, right? I mean, it's part of this nightmare, right? That have been living through. But this is so this was tied to shareholder value. Well, so the corporation can get money at what? Almost zero interest since the crash, right? Interest. So you can borrow money at almost no interest, and you can take that money and you can buy the shares of your own corporation. The corporation buys the shares of the corporation, right? To drive the value. In other words, you're creating a market, right? You're creating a bubble in your own stock. So this has been going on across the board. So you can see where I'm going with this. This is a large part of the run-up of the stock market, which is still going on. So now Tesla Motors is more valuable than Ford Motor Company. Obviously, Ford is not giving shareholder value appropriately. They should get with it.
How many cars did Tesla produce?
35,000 or something like this. Ford Motor produced how many cars? But Tesla's now worth more than Ford Motor Company on paper. Apple is the most valuable stock, I believe, in the world now. Valuable company by the value of its shares, bonds, and stocks. And this is the process. Okay, now, so okay. Well, what happens if this turns down? Go ahead. Let's go and see where we're going here. Well, the IMF just came out with this report. Again, consider them kind of a fake news source because, if they're telling the truth, it's because they're just, it's a CYA. They've decided that they've got to cover their derriere, and so they're letting the cat out of the bag because they got to at least be seen as being able to say, "I told you so." When they've in fact promoted the very policies that have been that have created the situation. But their report just came out, Global Financial Stability Report, 2017. Okay, just came out a few weeks ago. So in Financial Times of London, Wall Street Journal, various outlets are now covering charts that came out of that IMF report. Source IMF. Anyway, this is one of the charts out of it. Okay. What do we have at the top here? Resulting in a growing set of companies at risk of default. Okay. So they're looking here at U.S. corporations. This is a U.S. It doesn't say this here, but that's what it is. And so what you have here is they're saying these are, by percentage, That's what's up on the right-hand side, on the going vertical, is the percentage of companies that they view now in the US economy as weak, that is in danger of default, or vulnerable to default if there is any increase in interest rates. And so if you see here, they're saying 10%, are basically facing default, and 20% are within that range. And they're talking about short term. They're talking about in the months ahead. Okay. Because why? Well, you borrowed the money at no interest to buy back your own stock. Now you've got to pay back those loans, but the interest rates are going up.
Oh, and
right?
You have to pay
and you're going to be in a debt trap, right?
Yep.
So
You have to pay the interest rate, right?
so anyway, so let's go on to the next. This one is a related one. Okay, that's just that I put this up there as well. The color bars are that they use in this set. This is the same IMF figures, but you see the total they're talking about is 3.9 trillion is at risk. Okay, go on to the next. Oh, and well, and these bars are recessions. Okay, where it's gone up before, so-called recessions, depressions, financial collapses. 2000, 2001, which was the dot-com bubble, right? And you can see the number of companies that were, that went belly up or were at risk and so on and so forth was enormous. It jumped, of course, way up again in 2009. And what they're saying here is, once again, we're going in the same direction. We're reaching towards the same heights.
22%, right?
Right.
Wow.
Right. Okay, on to the next. This is from the IMF. This is, so if anything, they're understating the situation. Okay, so all right. I mean, this is basically this is the leveraging, and by that, this is the amount of debt to cash flow, to cash. It's a debt to cash ratio. And so you're looking here at the leveraging, and you're seeing again, comparing it to the past crises, 2008, 2001, the early 90s, 1991. That was the Asia financial crisis, the Russian GKO bond collapse, and then back to the 1980s period, the oil hoaxes and so forth and so on. So here again, the leveraging of these corporations is reaching to the peaks of the past crises. Okay, just go on. The point is not to fixate on these as cycles or something, or this kind of mumbo jumbo, but just to just really get a sense of what we've got coming together here as a train wreck. Okay, so this is a little difficult to explain, but this is, as they say, interest coverage ratio, and that is the strength of the company to handle its existing debt. Okay, and so the higher the blue line, the stronger your financial position versus your amount of debt. This is also IMF. And what they're pointing to here, the dotted red line to the right down at the bottom, higher financing costs. They're saying if going forward, right, the figures go through 2016 because the report just came out in 2017, right? They're saying if interest rates continue to go up, Janet Yellen and so forth, the Fed is slowly moving interest rates up, right? They're not talking about big interest rate jumps. They're just talking about, well, even if there's incremental quarter point, half point interest rate increases, then the interest coverage ratio of corporations sinks to the, to the levels of past financial crises, blowouts.
So the dotted line is showing, but it says higher financing costs, but it's going down.
If you have higher financing costs, the ratio will go down.
Ah, got it.
You're losing your viability as a company, right? Your debt to cash flow to earnings and so forth.
Becoming vulnerable.
Yes, more vulnerable. Okay. So this is just what this is what's out there. You're not reading it in the Houston Comical, but this is what's out there.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing that's so amazing about everything you're going through. None of us covered anywhere. I mean, not just this, but what you're going through before too.
Yeah. Now, additionally, since the IMF represents financial institutions, obviously, and the Financial Times of London and the Wall Street Journal and whatnot are reporting this, obviously banks know that this is the situation. So now what's happening to lending? This is the figures on commercial and industrial loans. Well, they're now going negative.
Can you read? It's hard to see.
Okay, U.S. banks posted the first drop in total commercial and industrial loans since 2010. So these are figures from 2010 on the far left, and the floor, if you will, is 0. So each year showed increments above. That's the percent, increase in lending that went on that year, and you see that it bobs up and down and so forth, right? But then between 2016 and the 2017, it's now dropped negative. Interest rates are not interest rates, but lending is contracting. Now, put that together with the fact that you have all of this prior borrowing by corporations and so forth in terms of speculation, not just buying back their own stock, but other forms of speculation. And that they've done this on the cheap, utilizing virtually 0 interest rates, which was created by the Fed to keep the whole thing afloat in the first place in 2008.
And that's included in the blue. All that stuff you're talking about.
Yeah.
So, but now it's 0 loans are being given out, because if you're saying it's below 0, or
No, the amount of loans.
the amount of loans.
If companies going to get a new loan or to roll over an old loan, right, go to the same bank, sorry, we're not lending now as much as we did before. We have different, we're more prudent or whatever, however they want to discuss it. We're not in a position to loan to you this year, that kind of thing. It's not an open, the door isn't being slammed shut. It's going negative, right? There's a contraction in lending. Okay, go ahead. And this just shows you already the increase in the prime interest rate. Okay, which is substantial, from where it's been. In other words, the Fed was making overnight money available at basically 0 interest rates. Lending, at banks was in the 3.5 range, and now it's gone up substantially. I mean, it's only gone up to 3.88, but that's a substantial increase. Remember, you're talking about 3.88% a year, and the multiplier of that, and then over years, right? So this is a substantial increase. Go ahead. Already. Now this didn't just start. I just put this up here partly to remind myself that this is not just starting now. Remember, we're sitting in the middle of Houston, Texas. We're in the middle of oil and gas, right? And that crash started, 2 years ago. And so their interest rates, to be able to find buyers of their debt in terms of what we would call otherwise junk bonds, but their Bloomberg is polite, they call them high yield. The reason they're high yield is because you got to pay high to find the suckers that will buy your stuff, right? Energy was the one that really, shot up in terms of the interest rates that they had to pay to find a buyer, and that began in 2014, and of course that's another reflection of what's going to happen in terms of is that more and more of these companies are going to have to pay higher and higher rates, far above prime rates, to find a market now more generally. So what I'm saying is, we already have a foretaste of what's coming more generally in terms of what's happened with oil and gas, and as you know, the profound effect it's had on the economy here in the Southwest of the United States in particular. But that's coming on more generally now because the same kind of thing exists otherwise, in terms for the reasons we've been going through here briefly. Okay, next one. And we already had, just as a result of the interest rate increases that the Fed and other central banks undertook in the last year or so, we already had a contraction, of loss of the global stock market capitalization by 15 trillion. That's just a broad figure. You add up the value of all the stock on all the major stock markets and say this is the value of the global capitalization of the markets. And
so even though they're driving the Dow Jones up, which is what everybody looks at, they're falling elsewhere.
Yeah, there's been all these, the markets went down and some went back up and others didn't. Developing markets went down and have not come up and so forth. Let me just, we can go on to the next one. This is just, this is a piece of artwork from the Mail collection.
Yeah, that's right.
This is the most interesting thing to point out here is, energy in terms of the challenge firms. These are numbers of challenge firms, the type of the markets they're in. So you see, that between 2014 and 16, of course, the red, oil, energy, oil and gas, became a major chunk, right? 30 plus percent, 32, 33% of the challenged firms. Well, you can see the green is the consumer debt. Remember, that was the mortgage bubble that burst. Right? And that's, so the consumer debt and companies that are dealing in consumer debt is a much smaller part of the problem today. Well, why is that? Well, it's because 7 out of every 10 Americans have less than $1,000 in savings. There's no there anymore for most people. And you can see other industrials have shrunken. Information technology has increased. You know why. Utilities is somewhat smaller. Anyway, that's quickly on that. Okay. Let me just read here before we're kind of shifting gears here and going to actual productivity. But let me just read, just so you have how they're. This is the Financial Times of published in London, the city. People aren't aware. The city, right, is the square mile, the infamous square mile inside the larger city of London. People know of the city of London, but inside the city of London is the city.
Like Wall Street.
Wall Street, yeah, the city, exactly. And so the Financial Times speaks for the city, okay? And so they're covering the IMF report. And we've shown a couple of the same graphs they've used, which they took from the IMF report. But here's what they say: a debt binge, that's what they call it, a debt binge, has left a quarter of U.S. corporate assets vulnerable to a sudden increase in interest rates, with the ability of companies to cover their interest payment at its weakest since the financial crisis. By one measure, the International Monetary Fund has warned. And then it talks about the the question of it tries to pan this off and says that if Trump goes with large budget deficits to finance infrastructure and so on, this will create inflation, and this will also feed the potential for rising interest rates. And it says it would also hit the borrowing costs of U.S. companies, which according to the IMF have loaded $7.8 trillion in debt and other liabilities since 2010. This is repeating some of what I said before, but I'm just, this is what's out there. This is just stated. By the IMF's calculations, companies with almost $4 trillion in assets, or 22% of total U.S. corporate assets, would be weak or vulnerable to a fiscal expansion that went wrong and led to a sharp rise in borrowing costs. So anyway, that repeats what I was saying, but I just wanted to get it from the Financial Times. That was I have the date here, April 19th of this year. So just switching gears, and we're coming here towards the end very quickly, but there was an article just yesterday in the Houston Chronicle, reprinted, I believe, from Reuters, the British news outlet, on the falling productivity in the United States and how this is a serious problem. Kind of buried in the business section. Well, here's the productivity figures going back to 1947. As you can see, from 47 to 73, we averaged a 2.8% increase in productivity per annum in the economy. Now, productivity is not a result of speed up. Right? It's primarily a result of investment in plant and equipment, and also training, skills, right? And then also education is also a factor in that, right? Not just on the job, but the education of people who are coming into the workforce to utilize more advanced technology, more advanced machinery, and so forth and so on. And then you see that dropping, from 73 for the recession on to 1.2. Rising no higher than 7.5. Remember, Volcker's high interest rate policies went into effect, if I recall correctly, it was 1979 when interest rates went up to almost 20% or 22%. There's shown here an increase in productivity in the 1990 to 2000 period of 2.2. Again, you have to think about these things. Because from the standpoint of physical economy, we measure things different. LaRouche's economics, physical economy, looks at this differently. A lot of that 1990-2000 was dot-coms, right? It was the so-called increasing productivity in the information technology, and a lot of that was and is hot air. And then up to, in the 2000-2007 period, up to 2.6, as shown here, and then dropping rapidly. And of course, that's the Obama administration period, down to 1.3%. And again, these figures this is the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, so you can just figure this is a lot of fakery involved in these figures as well. But it gives you an idea of what's happened. In other words, if you take the financial crash of 2000-2009, and you think of all the money that was pumped into the financial system, and all the money that was given away for people to help buy new refrigerators and new cars, and all that silliness, and it didn't do anything in terms of the real economy. Right? We're basically flatlined. We're comatose. Go on to the next. And this is a reflection of this. The blue line at the top, investment in equipment, would seem like, oh, well, that's a steady improvement from 1980 on. Well, then you got to subtract out, the utilization of equipment. You wear out equipment, and that's the dotted red line. And if you subtract the dotted red line from the dotted blue line, you're dropping down to close to zero, bouncing down back and forth around zero, right? with very little, even going all the way back to 1980, very little net investment in new equipment in the economy as a whole. You know, just an example, 3% of U.S. Freight moves by trains. We have half the rail lines that we had today as we had in 1970. Half of them, the lines, you know, the actual rail, half of it's gone. So, I mean, these are the kind of things when you step back and look at the actual physical economy as a totality. Go ahead.
Yeah, but now we got more white men.
Good point, Joel. Now, okay, so I just wanted to, I mentioned oil and gas. There was in 2016, there was a 50% increase in defaults in oil and gas, but that's, you know, that's only one part of the picture here. Let's look at, I mean, I'm just going to pull some other things out of the hat here. Okay, corporations are beginning to unload their financial, banks are unloading their corporate paper. The loans, you know, in other words, they issued loans to companies, to corporations. So they have a piece of paper with, you know, with a signature on it from that corporation. Well, Goldman Sachs and other companies are now trying to sell that paper, you know, at a discount. And if you want to buy some of it, they'll even finance you buying it from them, okay? They're trying to get out from under it. Some of what's been covered on, I mean, it's been limited. Goldman Sachs, as Paul Gallagher, our economics writer for Executive Intelligence Review, reported, Goldman Sachs division that handles its commercial lending and manufacturing lending is based in Salt Lake City. And they took major losses, and they're involved in a lot of sales, you know, to try to move corporate paper off the books now. But that was only reported in a really limited way in the Salt Lake press, you know, financial press, you know, local commercial papers covering commercial issues. But among other areas that this is occurring in, shopping malls. This is a Bloomberg article. Wall Street has found its next big short in U.S. credit market, and it's about shopping malls. And they're not, you know, they're not just talking about the shopping malls. They're talking about the real estate investment trusts, the RITs, that own the shopping malls. You know, in other words, they're trying to get out from under this stuff. And I don't think that comes as a big surprise. People know there are a lot of shopping malls, you know, that are shutting down. The stores, Macy's, Sears, you know, and so forth, right? Here's Financial Times. U.S. Credit card stocks sink to fresh lows. Capital One, Discover, they've all added $1 billion to cover for bad loans through credit cards. Credit card defaults are going up rapidly. So that means you want to get out. If you're, you know, if you're a bank and you're issuing credit card debt, you want to sell that credit card debt, you know, and you're willing to do it now at a fairly, you know, substantial discount, given the implications. Another big short. U.S. subprime auto loan losses reach highest levels since the financial crisis. This is March 10th of this year. Okay, you can go.
Subprime auto loan is what?
This is what's shown here.
A subprime
auto loan is like subprime mortgages. It's sold to somebody who doesn't really have the income to pay for that car. Right? Just doesn't, you know, it's subprime. It's risky. I mean, maybe they'll come up with the, you know, maybe whoever they are will make the payments because they really want to keep that car. But, you know, things happen. They lose a job. You know, there's an illness in the family, you know, any number of things.
And there are high interest rates too.
Right, higher interest rates. A feature of that in terms of auto loans, some of you may have actually been involved in this, but the latest figures on this show that 25% of vehicles being traded in for other used cars, you know, if you have a used car and it's, you know, it's a clunker and you got to get better wheels, but you can't afford a new car. So you're trading it in for another used car, right? Hopefully a little newer and better and so forth, right? 25% of vehicles being traded in for used car purchases had negative equity of $3,635.
Oh my God.
Which meant that when you bought your new used car,
Right.
that $3,635 was rolled over into the new auto loan that financed that new used car. Now this is just like LaRouche, cut his teeth back in the auto industry and forecast the '57 recession as an economist, based on the fact that people were into this thing of rolling over to the new models of cars, but they were increasingly getting behind in exactly this equivalent of this faction. They were not paying off. They were not being able to. In that case, it was they were not being able to pay off their old car before they bought the new car. So at a certain point, the whole thing just froze up, right? Because people couldn't buy the new cars.
It's sort of like paying your credit card with a credit card.
Yeah, right. And then what do you do? Right. But here's further. As reported from Edmunds, people know a little bit about cars, know about Edmunds and Blue Book and all that kind of stuff. The latest report from Edmunds, the new car market isn't any better. 32% of trade-ins, this is trade-ins for a new car, an actual new car, have an average negative equity balance of $4,832. So in buying a new car, you're rolling that over, that $4,832 on top of the price of the new car, which is what, 25,000? I mean, 20,000, 25, 30, and they're paying the interest rate on that. Now, what happens when those interest rates go up? So, or if you're holding the paper, which is only paying at 3.5, 3.8%, and the interest rates go up, then how much is the paper if you bought a slice, a bundled bunch of car loans, and interest rates go up, and the paper you've got is both, you have a high default rate and you have a rate of return guaranteed on that paper of 3.8, and the interest rates are going to 5. Where are you? Or where are you as a bank, or where are you as a hedge fund or a retirement fund or whatever holding that paper? That covers, that's what I wanted to cover. Go on to that way where you can see this is this growth. This is the percentage of car loans owned and securitized outstanding. That is, the debt is outstanding.
What's the dotted line?
Well, that's just for emphasis.
Oh,
That's just for emphasis.
Okay.
I didn't put it in there, it's just in the, yeah. Go ahead to the next. See what else. Oh, this is bank card default rates by region of the country. If one wants to decipher that, you can, but you get the, even without deciphering it, breaking it down.
What region is the one that's the highest?
The highest one there is the South,
Oh, wow.
and followed by the West.
We're number one.
But the Northeast ain't far behind, nor is the Midwest. So go on to the next. Okay.
Oh,
Well,
thank
this-
you. So much
This takes, sanity. Sanity.
Are you gonna?
This is Alexander Hamilton.
Wow.
This is Alex. Yeah, what a change. Right?
Okay.
First of all, it's words, not just charts. Yeah. I'm sorry if I blew out your synapses with all those charts, but I thought it was at least, would be visceral. But here's Alexander from the report on what? Report on manufacturing. Right? And he's arguing, this is to the Congress, right? They asked him to do this report. He prepared this report, lengthy report. It's more one of the most famous documents of the American founding fathers. So here he is, and he's arguing why not agrarian economy? Jefferson, infamously was a promoter of the agrarian economy. He was a promoter of the slaveocracy. That's what he was promoting. As was Locke and Hume and the Brits and, who promoted this viewpoint. So Hamilton, though, is promoting and saying, no, we have to not simply rely on agriculture. We have to develop manufacturing. We have to develop a full set economy, I guess you could say. So here, just this paragraph here. This also is of greater consequence in the general scale of national exertion than might perhaps on a superficial view be supposed, and has effects not altogether dissimilar from those of the circumstance last noticed. Here's to cherish and stimulate the activity of the human mind by multiplying the objects of enterprise is not among the least considerable of the expedients by which the wealth of a nation may be promoted. And this is the heart of a return to real economics and to economic recovery, and to joining the Silk Road, the new Silk Road. Go on to the next. I'll go on to the next. I guess. Well, and this is. We'll just wrap with this. This is. These are. You might notice by the pants they're wearing, or pantaloons, or whatever the right term would be. These are Indian scientists, men and women, working on their space program. I'm not sure. This may be part. I can't remember where this was taken from. It may be part of their Mars project, which is up there circling Mars right now. But this is the future, as opposed to the charts. As opposed to the world of charts.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're off the charts.
Questions and answers. We're open for discussion. You can turn on the light, John. Thanks. Thanks for your attention.
Right,
Yeah.
chronology. LaRouche predicted the crash in 2007.
Oh, there's a triple curve in here. Could you move forward to it?
Okay.
Maybe. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Louise.
LaRouche predicted the crash in 2007 in July, right?
Right.
And then officially the crash was on in November, right?
Well, according to some and others, it didn't really hit in full force until 2008.
Well, we
But
were
I mean,
having
that's-
the elections, though, it was out in the open for the,
Yeah, it was
right,
an issue.
at the time, in between,
Right.
The vote.
And if you recall, he had put forward the help me out here.
Homeowners and Bank Protection Act.
Yeah.
Homeowners and Bank Protection Act.
LaRouche.
Protection Act in 2007, right? He put that forward forcefully,
Right.
to saying, okay, we've got to freeze the mortgages. We got to. Everyone has to be kept in the houses. No foreclosures. A freeze on foreclosures. That was the word I was looking for, right? And then we'll go in. Federal, the bank auditors and so forth will go in, and over time, no rush, no hurry, we're going to sort this out. We're going to write down the value of these overpriced homes, because this has been this bubble. We're going to write these down, and then people will pick up their payments, at these lower levels, as the house is marked down to something approximating some real baseline value of the home. And the banks that are in trouble, well, then we'll work with the banks to get them through this, right? To stretch out, if necessary, to provide liquidity, that kind of thing, as we did in the 30s, 1933, 34, 35. That's what we could have done. It's worth recalling.
It is.
Instead of what happened, right? Which was millions of people lost their homes. Hell was paid.
Still okay.
No, and we're still paying.
That's right.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. So, and this is very, very useful, very important as a pedagogical. This is developed back in the 1990s, as I recall, late 1990s. As you can see, LaRouche's triple curve, and of course the timeline running from left to right. And what LaRouche was pointing to, I think you can kind of get the idea here. He was looking at this what he called a typical collapse function, which is what we've been discussing here. And this just sums it up. You have this growth of monetary aggregates, financial derivatives based, piled on top of debt on financial paper and so forth. You have that's financial aggregates up to a point. You have this growth of financial aggregates, but then you have the growth of the money supply required to turn over that financial paper, right? The financial paper only has confidence except there's a market for it, right? So there's got to be money out there to turn it over. But once, right, there's a loss of confidence. The tendency on the part of policy is to continue the monetary aggregates, to continue to grow the money supply, but the financial aggregates turn down. But that's the real collapse, the fundamental collapse, which has been going on throughout the whole period, is the physical economic collapse, right, of inputs and outputs in terms of the real economy. Go ahead. Yes, sir.
The aggregates, the monetary aggregates,
Yes.
They're artificial in nature. I mean, they're created out of thin air.
Right. As measured against this, right? You're right. That's yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So this is this is where this is your discontinuity, right? When you hit the collapse, it's like a sound barrier kind of situation.
And it only accelerated with the QE and the stimulus, the make-believe money that's generated.
Yes. Rather than solving it, we accelerate. Yes.
And actually, when Lynn first developed that, what he said each one of those lines represent, the graph going up and down, it's like a derivative. It's the rate of change, the rate of growth, or the rate of contraction. And that even is more, amplifies even more, because we're not even looking at just a gross quantity in relationship, but we're looking at the driver, the relationship
The rate of change. Rate of change of the rate.
Yeah.
Brian, can you just say something about how Glass-Steagall would deal with all of this, and also, the rest of the because we presented a pretty dramatic picture.
Yes, well, we have right now before Congress, we have now Senate Bill 881, and we have House Bill, HR, not House Resolution, but HR stands for House of Representatives, HR 790. These are the bills to reenact a 21st century Glass-Steagall Act, to reenact Glass-Steagall. Those are before Congress right now. The House bill introduced by Representative Marcy Kaptur of Ohio, a formerly industrialized state, now has 48 sponsors at our last count as of Friday. And the Senate, having picked up 5 more in the last few days. And then the Senate bill has added 2 more senators, Senator Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin and Jeff Merkley of Oregon. So there's now, I think, 8 total senators sponsoring the bill. Thank you. HR 790 and S 881. S for Senate bill. Yep. And your congressman, every congressman, needs to hear from you in support of the reenactment of Glass-Steagall immediately. Trump this last week gave an interview to Bloomberg in which he said now Glass-Steagall is being considered by the administration. There's people who want to go back to this system. So we're studying it right now. I mean, that was a volunteered on his part. That wasn't something that he was being probed on by. He dropped that in the interview.
So are those subject to the House Speaker bringing them up for a vote?
They're both in committee. They're going to have to be moved.
Because good bills have been introduced in the past, but never been brought up for consideration by the full vote. So is it up to Ryan or to bring it up to a vote?
It's calls to people like that are calls obviously are fine, and we want to do that. But it really is a matter of the American people demanding this of their congressmen to step back. Well, let me first outline Glass-Steagall before we go further, really briefly. I mean, I think most people are familiar with it. But Glass, for our listeners at home as well. Glass-Steagall was enacted in 1933 by Congressman Glass and Senator Steagall. It was Roosevelt's legislation. That passed on a bipartisan basis. And what it did was regulate the banks. It separated investment banks and speculation on the one side from commercial banks on the other side of a firewall. It set up the FDIC. It set up the payments from commercial banks to the FDIC. And the FDIC guaranteed the deposits of depositors into the commercial banks. And the commercial banks could no longer speculate with their depositors' money. Their money had to be lent to normal commercial lending, business, farms, homes, and so on and so forth. Investment banks were a whole other category, and if they lost money, they were on their own, and they were just halved off. And a lot of bankers went to jail in this period too with the Pecora hearings because they had brought on the collapse of the 1930s. So Glass-Steagall was repealed in 1999 in the midst of President Bill Clinton being hit with the Monica Lewinsky scandal and all that, and it was put through by our dear Senator Graham of Texas and others. And Phil doesn't have a gram of brains, Phil. And so that set us up for the crash. And so now we've got to reenact Glass-Steagall. And in reenacting it, you'd have to, that bank auditors, government auditors will have to go in and help the banks sort this out because all of the major banks now are heavily into massive speculation. And so their books are going to have to be cleaned up and of course reorganized in the process. So this is it's the first step to a recovery. Now, what I've just been outlining in terms of the financial collapse that's coming on now in terms of corporate collapse, corporate blowout, is part of the impetus for Glass-Steagall. It's why Trump is talking about Glass-Steagall. It's why there's virtually every day there's an article in the Wall Street Journal, the American Banker, Financial Times, or some other outlet or website attacking Glass-Steagall, attacking it. The latest was yesterday. Bank of America's president, CEO, had this raving editorial that this was lunacy to be considering Glass-Steagall. The last one happened to be in the Wall Street Journal that I recall was the one from the former president of Wells Fargo, the guy that had to quit because of the scandal at Wells Fargo. Anyway, but this is hot. This is hot because they know the collapse is coming on. They know we're heading into this again. So, and they know we almost moved with Glass-Steagall before. That was before the Congress. You know, it was moved as an amendment to the Dodd-Frank bill, Glass-Steagall, and so forth. So they know that this can come through. So when I say we have to get to every congressman, we have to get to them from the standpoint of the urgency of the situation. We've been up on Capitol Hill meeting with the Congress. Paul Gallagher, Nomi Prince has been with us, who's a former, top managing director of Goldman Sachs, up there meeting and going through this briefing with congressmen. And they're saying, you're here telling us this. Nobody else is telling us this. But they're not saying this from the standpoint of we don't believe you. It's that you guys are the only people that have got credibility, in our eyes, because, you're presenting this, this picture, in depth. But that by itself isn't going to move votes. It's going to have to be the American people. So we've got the legislation introduced. We've got the support building, and we have to up the ante, knowing that we've got this kind of wind behind our sails in terms of the oncoming crisis that makes this so critically important. Is that? I mean, go ahead. I mean, I'm asking Evelyn, but also you. I mean, I'm trying to cover Glass-Steagall without getting bogged down in a lot.
I agree with the importance.
Mm-hmm.
I just wonder how effective a phone call would be to our. Would that be enough? I mean,
visits to your congressional line, corralling some of your friends, or coming in with us on some of our delegation meetings. All of those things. Congress is right now on recess for a week. So now is a time. They're in their districts. What's the term?
We call it their district work period.
So put them to work.
So contacting our state reps, would that be?
If you know a state rep, because this so much bears on the state of the economy, right? That we're going through a state budget cut. You know, the city's facing these huge, loads in terms of pensions and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
This is all related to the economic collapse.
Yeah, because if the state's reps see that money could be, in their opinion, lost from the feds, then they probably wouldn't support it because they want to receive more.
Mm-hmm.
So it's difficult to get them motivated to not get that money. So it has to be, we have to put some teeth behind it somehow to motivate them to get on the side of Glass-Steagall.
Well, let me give you an example. Have you ever heard of the bill that was called JASTA, Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act?
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, that bill, was to allow the families of the 9/11 victims to sue Saudi Arabia, right? And Saudi Arabians have a lot of money. They put $5, $10, $20 million into lobbying against it. The president was vociferously against that
The
bill.
previous president.
Yeah.
Yes.
The previous.
Obama,
The one we
yes.
threw out, yes.
But
But hold on a second. But there was never, there was never, and even the lying, failing New York Times had to admit this, there was never a mass mobilization for JASTA. There was never a big discussion in Congress about JASTA. But what there was that around the anniversary of 9/11, the 15th year anniversary, the LaRouche movement held in the area of New York City four living memorial concerts using Mozart's Requiem, which I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a really sublime piece. It gives human beings an idea of justice and what it is to be immortal. And that helped to create a kind of impetus for some of the families and relative
Law enforcement.
Yeah, law enforcement. Relative
First
handfuls of
responders.
people to go down to Washington, and they pushed it through.
It went through like,
And
Just
so Obama,
Reese
our
Light.
former president, the Nazi, vetoed it. And then it was overridden 97-1 in the Senate.
But the sympathy was generated because of the families and the.
But the sympathy had been there the whole time for 15 years. What changed?
Organizing.
Because the reason I'm saying this is because some of the people took it up with a passion that they were not going to allow justice to be denied any longer. And that was their personal fight that they were taking total responsibility for. And they conveyed that to senators and congressmen and friends and neighbors one-on-one. And what's lacking with Glass-Steagall right now is not that we don't have the president's support. He says he's for it. Both political parties said they're for it. They did it a few years ago. They did a poll in the Senate. 60 senators said they were for it. We've had up to 100 congressmen signed on to the bill. One of the reasons that Trump came out for it in the first place was the numbers of polling that said it was for it. But we need people like you to join with us to be the people who make it not is it going to happen, but we're going to see that this happens. Every talk show, every social media, every meeting that you can go to,
Because I understand that that act, the Justice Against Terrorism,